Boys Will Be Boys, Part 1, by Irvin S. Cobb. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mike Harris. When Judge Priest, in this particular morning, came puffing into his chambers at the courthouse, looking with his broad beam and his costume of flappy, loose white ducks, a good deal like an old-fashioned full-rigger with all sails set, his black shadow, Jeff Poindexter, had already finished the job of putting the quarters to rights for the day. The cedar water bucket had been properly replenished. The jagged flange of a 15-cent chunk of ice protruded above the rim of the bucket, and alongside on the appointed nail hung the gourd dipper that the master always used. The floor had been swept, except, of course, in the corners and underneath things. There were evidences in its streaky scrolls of fine grit particles upon various flat surfaces that a dusting brush had been more or less sparingly employed. A spray of trumpet flowers plucked from the vine that grew outside the window had been draped over the framed steel engraving of President Davis and his cabinet upon the wall, and on the top of the big square desk in the middle of the room, where a small section of cleared green blotter space formed an oasis in a dry and arid desert of cluttered law journals and dusty documents, the morning's mail rested in a little heap. Having placed his old cotton umbrella in a corner, having removed his coat and hung it upon a peg behind the hall door, and having seen to it that a palm-leaf fan was in arm's reach should he require it, the judge in his billowy white shirt sat down at his desk and gave his attention to his letters. There was an invitation from the Highland B. Gracie camp of Confederate veterans of Edinburgh, asking him to deliver the chief oration at the annual reunion, to be held at Mineral Springs on the 12th day of the following month. An official notice from the clerk of the Court of Appeals concerning the affirmation of a judgment that had been handed down by Judge Priest at the preceding term of his own court. A bill for £5 of a special brand of smoking tobacco. A notice of a large meeting. Altogether quite a sizable batch of mail. At the bottom of the pile he came upon a long envelope addressed to him by his title instead of by his name, bearing on its upper right-hand corner several foreign-looking stamps. They were British stamps, he saw on closer examination. To the best of his recollection, it had been quite a long time since Judge Priest had had a communication by post from overseas. He adjusted his steel-bowed spectacles, ripped the wrapper with care, and shook out the contents. There appeared to be several enclosures. In fact, there were several. A sheaf of printed forms, a document with seals attached, and a letter that covered 2 sheets of paper with typewritten lines. To the letter the recipient gave consideration first. Before he reached the end of the opening paragraph he uttered a profound grunt of surprise. His reading of the rest was frequently punctuated by small exclamations, his face meantime puckering up in interested lines. At the conclusion, when he came to the signature, he indulged himself in a soft, low whistle. He read the letter all through again, and after he examined the forms and the documents which had accompanied it. Chuckling under his breath, he wriggled himself free from the snug embrace of his chair-arms and waddled out of his own office and down the long, bare, empty hall to the office of Sheriff Giles Birdsong. Within, the competent functionary, Deputy Sheriff Breck Quarles, sat at ease in his shirt-sleeves, engaged with the smaller blade of his pocket-knife in performing upon his fingernails an operation that combined the fine deftness of the manicure with the less delicate art of the farrier. At the sight of the judge in the open doorway he hastily withdrew from a tabletop where they rested a pair of long, thin legs, and rose. "Morning, Breck," said Judge Priest to the other's salutation. "No, thank you, son, I won't come in, but I've got a little job for you. I wished, if you ain't too busy, that you'd step down the street and see if you can find a peep o'day for me, and fetch him back here with you. Won't take you long, will it?" "No, sir, not very." Mr. Quarles reached for his hat and snuggled his shoulder holster back inside his unbuttoned waistcoat. "He'll most likely be down around Gafford's stable. What's old Pete been doing, Judge? Getting himself in contempt of court or something?" He grinned, asking the question with the air of one making a little joke. "No," vouchsafed the judge, "he ain't done nothing, but he's about to have something of a highly unusual nature done to him. You just tell him I'm wishful to see him right away. That'll be sufficient, I reckon." Without making further explanation, Judge Priest returned to his chambers and, for the third time, read the letter from foreign parts. Court was not in session, and the hour was early, and the weather was hot. Nobody interrupted him. Perhaps 15 minutes passed. Mr. Quarles poked his head in the door. "I found him, sir," the deputy stated. "He's outside here in the hall." "Much obliged to you, son," said Judge Priest. "Send him on in now, will you, please?" The head was withdrawn. Its owner lingered out of sight of His Honor, but within earshot. It was hard to figure the presiding judge of the First Judicial District of the State of Kentucky as having business with Peep O'Day, and though Mr. Quarles was no eavesdropper, still he felt a pardonable curiosity in whatsoever might transpire. As he feigned an absorbed interest in a tax notice, which was pasted on a blackboard just outside the office door, there entered the presence of the judge a man who seemingly was but a few years younger than the judge himself, a man who looked to be somewhere between 65 and 70. There is a look that you may have seen in the eyes of ownerless but well-intentioned dogs that, expecting kicks as their daily portion, are humbly grateful for kind words and stray bones. Dogs that are fairly yearning to be adopted by somebody, by anybody, being prepared to give to such a benefactor a most faithful, dog-like devotion in return. Well, this look, which is fairly common among masterless and homeless dogs, is rare among humans. Still, once in a while you do find it there, too. The man who now timidly shuffled himself across the threshold of Judge Priest's office had just such a look out of his eyes. He had a long, simple face, partly enclosed in gray whiskers. $4 would have been a sufficient price to pay for the garments he stood in, including the wrecked hat he held in his hands and the broken, misshapen shoes on his feet. A purchaser who gave more than $4 for the whole in its present state of decrepitude would have been but a poor hand at bargaining. The man who wore this outfit coughed in an embarrassed fashion and halted, fumbling his ruinous hat in his hands. "How they do?" said Judge Priest heartily. "Come right in." The other diffidently advanced himself a yard or two. "Excuse me, sir," he said apologetically, "but this here Breck Quarles, he come after me, and he said as how you wanted to see me. 'Twas him as brung me here, sir." Faintly underlying the drawl of the speaker was just a suspicion, a mere trace, as you might say, of a labial softness that belongs solely and exclusively to the children, in a diminishing degree to the grandchildren of native-born sons and daughters of a certain small green isle in the sea. It was not so much a suggestion of a brogue as it was the suggestion of the ghost of a brogue almost extinguished, almost obliterated, yet persisting through the generations, south of Ireland, struggling beneath south of Mason Dixon's line. "Yes," said the judge, "that's right. I do want to see you." The tone was one that he might employ in addressing a bashful child. "Now, you sit down there, and you just make yourself at home." The newcomer obeyed to the extent of perching himself on the extreme forward edge of a chair. His feet shuffled uneasily where they were drawn up against the cross-rung of the chair. The judge reared well back, studying his visitor over the tops of his glasses with rather a quizzical look. In one hand he balanced the large envelope which had come to him that morning. "Seems to me I heard somewheres years back that your regular Christian name was Paul. Is that right?" "Yeah." "Surely is, sir," assented the ragged man, surprised and plainly grateful that one holding a supremely high position in the community should vouchsafe to remember a fact relating to so inconsequential an atom as himself. "But I ain't heard it for so long, I come mighty nigh forgetting it sometimes myself. You see, Judge Priest, when I wasn't nothing but just a shaver, folks started in to call me Peep, on account of my last name being O'Day, I reckon. They've been calling me so ever since. First off, 'twas Little Peep, and then just plain Peep, and now it's got to be Old Peep. Yeah, but my real entitled name is Paul, just like you said, Judge. Paul Felix O'Day." And wasn't your father's name Philip and your mother's name Catherine Dwyer O'Day?" "To the best of my recollection, that's partly so, too, sir. They both of 'em up and died when I was a baby, long before I could remember anything at all. But they always told me my pa's name was Phil, or Philip. Only my ma's name wasn't Kath, wasn't what you just now called it, Judge. It was plain Kate." Kate or Catherine, it makes no great difference," exclaimed Judge Priest. "I reckon the record is straight so far. And now think hard, and see if you can ever remember hearing of an uncle named Daniel O'Day, your father's brother." The answer was a shake of the tousled head. "I don't know nothing about my people. I only just know that they come over from some place with a funny name in the old country before I was born. The onlyest kin I ever had over here was that there no-count trifling nephew of mine, Perce Dwyer, him that used to hang out around this town. I reckon you call him to mind, Judge." The old judge nodded before continuing. "All the same, I reckon there ain't no manner of doubt but what you had an uncle of the name of Daniel. All the evidence would seem to pint that way. According to the proofs, this here Uncle Daniel of yours lived in a little town called Kilmare in Ireland." He glanced at one of the papers that lay on his desk, then added in a casual tone, "Tell me, Peep, what are you doing now for a living?" The object of this examination grinned a faint grin of extenuation. "Well, sir, I'm knocking about, doing the best I can, which ain't much. I help out round Gafford's liver stable, and Pete Gafford he lets me sleep in a little room behind the feed room, and his wife she gives me my victuals. Once in a while I get a chance to do odd jobs for folks around town, cutting weeds and splitting stove wood and packing in coal, such as that." "Not much money in that, is there?" "Well, no, sir, not much. Folks is more prone to offer me old clothes than they are to pay me in cash. Still, I manage to get along. I don't live very fancy, but then I don't starve, and that's more'n some can say. Peep, what was the most money you ever had in your life at one time?" Peep scratched with a freckled hand at his thatch of faded whitish hair to stimulate recollection. "I reckon not more'n 6 bits at any one time, sir. Seems like I've sort of got the knack of living without money." "Well, Pete, such being the case, what would you say if I was to tell you that you're a rich man?" The answer came slowly. "I reckon, sir, if it didn't sound disrespectful, I'd say you was pranking with me, making fun of me, sir." Judge Priest bent forward in his chair. "I'm not pranking with you, son. It's my pleasant duty to inform you that at this moment you are the rightful owner of £8,000. "Pounds of what, Judge?" The tone expressed a heavy incredulity. "Why, pounds in money." Outside in the hall, with one ear held conveniently near the crack of the door, Deputy Sheriff Quarles gave a violent start, and then at once was torn between a desire to stay and hear more and an urge to hurry forth and spread the unbelievable tidings. After the briefest of struggles, the latter inclination won. This news was too marvellously good to keep. Surely a harbinger and a herald were needed to spread it broadcast. Mr. Quarles tiptoed rapidly down the hall. When he reached the sidewalk, the volunteer bearer of a miraculous tale fairly ran. As for the man who sat facing the judge, he merely stared in a dull bewilderment. "Judge," he said at length, £8,000 of money ought to make a powerful big pile, oughtn't it?" "It wouldn't weigh quite that much if you put it on the scales," explained his Honor painstakingly. "I mean pounds sterling, English money. Near as I can figure offhand, it comes in our money to somewheres between $35,000 and $40,000, nearer 40 than 35, and it's yours, Pete, every red cent of it." "Excuse me, sir, and not meaning to contradict you or nothing like that, but I reckon there must be some mistake. Why, Judge, I don't scoosely know anybody that's as wealthy as all that, let alone anybody that'd give me such a lot of money." "Listen here, Pete. This here letter I'm holding in my hand came to me by today's mail, just a little spell ago. It's from Ireland, from that town of Kilmare where your people come from. It was sent to me by a firm of barristers in that town. They're lawyers, we'd call them. In this letter they asked me to find you and to tell you what's happened. It seems, from what they write, that your uncle, by name Daniel O'Day, died not very long ago without issue, that is to say, without leaving any children of his own, and without making any will. It appears that he had some £8,000 saved up. Ever since he died, those lawyers and some other folks over there in Ireland have been trying to find out who that money should go to. They learnt in some way that your father and your mother settled in this town a mighty long time ago. and that they died here and left one son, which is you. All the rest of the family over there in Ireland have already died out, it seems. That naturally makes you the next of kin and the heir at law, which means that all your uncle's money comes direct to you. So, Pete, you're a wealthy man in your own name. That's the news I had to tell you. Allow me to congratulate you on your good fortune." The beneficiary rose to his feet, seeming not to see the hand the old judge had extended across the desktop toward him. On his face, of a sudden, was a queer, eager look. It was as though he foresaw the coming true of long-cherished and heretofore unattainable visions. "Have you got it here, sir?" He glanced about him as though expecting to see a bulky bundle. Judge Priest smiled. "Oh, no, they didn't send it along with the letter. That wouldn't be regular. There's quite a lot of things to be done first. There'll be some proofs to be got up and sworn to before a man called a British consul, and likely there'll be a lot of papers that you'll have to sign, and then all the papers and the proofs and things will be sent across the ocean, and after some fees are paid out over there, then you'll get your inheritance." The rapt look faded from the strained face, leaving it downcast. I'm afeard, then, I won't be able to claim that there money," he said forlornly. "Why not?" "Because I don't know how to sign my own name. Raised the way I was and never got no book learning. I can't neither read nor write." Compassion shadowed the judge's chubby face, and compassion was in his voice as he made answer. "You don't need to worry about that part of it. You can make your mark, just a cross mark on the paper with witnesses present, sort of like this." He took up a pen and dipped it in the inkwell and illustrated his meaning. "Yes, sir, I'm glad it can be done that way. I always wished I knew how to write big print and spell my own name out. I asked a feller once to write my name out for me in plain letters on a piece of paper. I was aiming to learn to copy it off, but I showed it to one of the hands at the liver stable, and he busted out laughing, and then he come to find out that this here fellow had tricked me for to make a game of me. He hadn't wrote my name out at all. He'd written some dirty words instead. So after that, I give up trying to educate myself. Now, that was several years back, and I ain't tried since. Now, I reckon I'm too old to learn. I wonder if it'll be very long before that there money gets here, and I begin to have the spending of it." "Making plans already?" "Oh, yes, sir," O'Day answered truthfully. "I am." He was silent for a moment, his eyes on the floor. Then, timidly, he advanced the thought that had come to him. I reckon, sir, it wouldn't be no more'n fair and proper if I divided my money with you to pay you back for all this trouble you're fixing to take on my account. Would half of it be enough? The other half ought to last me for what uses I'll make of it." I know you mean well, and I'm much obliged to you for your offer," stated Judge Priest, smiling a little. "But it wouldn't be fitting or proper for me to touch a cent of your money. There'll be some court dues and some lawyers' fees and such to pay over there in Ireland, but after that's settled up, everything comes direct to you. It's going to be a pleasure to me to help you arrange these here details that you don't understand. A pleasure, and not a burden." He considered the figures before him. "Now, here's another thing, Pete. Judge, it's hardly fitting for a man of substance to go on living the way you've had to live during your life. If you don't mind my offering you a little advice, I would suggest that you go right down to Felsberg Brothers when you leave here and get yourself fitted out with some suitable clothing. And you'd better go to Max Biederman's, too, and order a better pair of shoes for yourself than them you got on. Tell them I sent you, and that I guarantee the payment of your bills. Though I reckon they'll hardly be necessary. When the news of your good luck gets noised around, I misdoubt whether there's any firm in our entire city that wouldn't be glad to have you on their books for a steady customer. And also, if I was you, I'd arrange to get me regular board and lodging somewheres around town. You see, Pete, coming into a property entails considerable many responsibilities right from the start." "Yes, sir," assented the legatee obediently. "I'll do just as you say, Judge Priest, about the clothes and the shoes and all that, but if you don't mind, I'd like to go on living at Gafford's. Pete Gafford's been mighty good to me, him and his wife both, and I wouldn't like for him to think I was getting stuck up just 'cause I've had this here streak of luck come to me. Maybe, seeing as how things has changed with me, they'd be willing to take me in for a table boarder at their house. But I surely would hate to give up living in that there little room behind the feed room of the livery stable. I don't know as I could ever find any place that would seem as homelike to me as what it is." "Well, suit yourself about that," said Judge Priest heartily. "I don't know but what you've got the proper notion about it after all." "Yes, sir. Them Gaffords have been pretty nigh the only real true friends I ever had that I could count on." He hesitated a moment. I reckon, sir, it'll be a right smart while, won't it, before that money gets here from all the way across the ocean?" "Why, yes, I imagine it will. Was you figuring on investing a little of it now?" Yes, sir, I was." "About how much did you think of spending for a beginning?" O'Day squinted his eyes, his lips moving in silent calculation. "Well, sir, he said it like I could use as much as a silver dollar, but of course, since—" "That sounds kind of moderate to me," broke in Judge Priest. He shoved a pudgy hand into a pocket of his white trousers. "I reckon this detail can be arranged. Here, Pete." He extended his hand. "Here's your dollar." Then, as the other drew back, stammering a refusal, he hastily added, No. Go ahead and take it. It's yours. I'm just advancing it to you out of what'll be coming to you shortly. I'll tell you what. Until such time as you're in a position to draw on your own funds, you just drop in here to see me when you're in need of cash, and I'll try to let you have what you require, in reason. I'll keep a proper reckoning of what you get, and you can pay me back just as soon as your inheritance is put into your hands. Oh, one thing more," he added, as the heir, having thanked him, was making his grateful adieu at the threshold. "Now that you're wealthy, or about to be so, I kind of imagine quite a passel of fellows will be suddenly discover themselves strangely and affectionately drawed towards you. You're liable to find out you've always had more true and devoted friends in this community than what you ever imagined to be the case before. Now, friendship is a mighty fine thing, taking it by and large, but it can be overdone. It's barely possible that some of this here new crop of your well-wishers and admirers will be making little business propositions to you, desiring to have you go partners with them in business, or to sell you desirable pieces of real estate, or even to let you loan them various sums of money. I wouldn't be surprised what a number of such chances will be coming your way during the next few days. And from then on, if such should be the case, I would suggest to you that before committing yourself to anybody or anything, you tell them that I'm sort of acting as your unofficial advisor in money matters, and that they should come to me and outline their little schemes in person. Do you get my general drift?" "Yes, sir," said Pete. "I won't forget. And thank you again, Judge, especially for letting me have this dollar ahead of time." He shambled out with the coin in his hand, and on his face was again the look of one who sees before him the immediate fulfillment of a delectable dream. With lines of sympathy and amusement cross-hatched at the outer corners of his eyelids, Judge Priest, rising and stepping to his door, watched the retreating figure of the town's newest and strangest capitalist disappear down the wide front steps of the courthouse. Presently he went back to his chair and sat down, tugging at his short chin-beard. "I wonder now," said he, meditatively addressing the emptiness of the room, "I wonder what a man 60-odd-year-old's going to do with the first whole dollar he ever had in his life." It was characteristic of our circuit judge that he should have voiced his curiosity aloud. Talking to himself when he was alone was one of his habits. Also, it was characteristic of him that he had refrained from betraying his inquisitiveness to his late caller. Similar motives of delicacy had kept him from following the other man to watch the sequence. However, at second hand, the details very shortly reached him. They were brought by no less a person than Deputy Sheriff Quarles, who, some 20 minutes or possibly half an hour later, obtruded himself upon Judge Priest's presence. "Judge," began Mr. Quarles, "you never in the world guess what old Peep O'Day done with the first piece of money he got his hands on out of that there 40,000 pounds of silver dollars he's coming in from his uncle's estate." The old man slanted a keen glance in Mr. Quarles' direction. "Tell me, son," he asked softly, "how did you come to hear the glad tidings so promptly?" "Me?" said Mr. Quarles innocently. Why, Why, Judge Priest, the word's all over this part of town by this time. Why, I reckon 25-50 people must have been watching old Peep to see how he's going to act when he come out of this courthouse. Well, murmured the judge blandly. Good news travels almost as fast sometimes as what bad news does, now don't it now? Well, son, I give up the riddle. Tell me just what your elderly friend did do with the first installment of his inheritance. Well, sir, he turned south here at the gate and went right down the street, a-looking neither to the right nor the left. He looked to me like a man in a trance almost. He kept tight on through Legal Road till he comes to Franklin Street, and then he goes up Franklin to B. Weil and Sons confectionery store, and there he turns in. Well, I happened to be following along behind him with a few others, with several others, in fact, and we all sort of slowed up in passing and looked in at the door. And that's how I come to be in a position to see what happened. Now, old P.P. marches in just like I'm telling you. Just like I'm telling it to you, sir. And Mr. B. Weil comes to wait on him, and he starts in buying. He buys himself a 5-cent bag of gumdrops, and a 5-cent bag of jelly beans, and a 10-cent bag of mixed candies, kisses and candy mottos and such as them, you know, and a sack of fresh roasted peanuts, a big sack. It was a 15-cent size, and 2 prize boxes, and some ginger snaps, 10 cents worth, and a coconut, and half a dozen red bananas, and half a dozen more of the plain yellow ones. Altogether, I figure he spent an even $1. In fact, I seen him hand Mr. Weil $1, and I didn't see him get no change back out of it. Then he comes on out of the store, with all these things stuck in his pockets, and stacked up in his arms, till he looked sort of like some new kind of summertime Santa Claus. And he sets down on a goods box at the edge of the pavement, with his feet in the gutter, and starts in eating all them things. First he takes a bite off a yeller banana, and then off a red banana, and then a mouthful of peanuts, and then maybe some mixed candies, not saying a word to nobody, but just naturally eating his fool head off. A young chap that's clerking in Bagby's grocery next door steps up to him and speaks to him, meaning I suppose to ask him, is it true he's wealthy? And old Pete, he says to him, please don't come bothering me now, sonny. I'm busy catching up, he says, and keeps right on munching and a-chewing like all possessed. And that ain't all of it, neither, Judge. Not by a long shot it ain't. Pretty soon old Peep, he looks around him at the little crowd that's gathered. He didn't seem to pay no heed to the grown-up people standing there, but sees a couple of boys about 10-year-old in the crowd, and he beckons to them to come to him, and he makes room for 'em alongside him on the box and divides up his knickknacks with 'em. When I left there, come bound back here, he had no less than 6 kids squatting around him, including one little nigger boy. And between 'em all, they'd just finished up the last of the bananas and peanuts, and the candy, and the ginger snaps, and was fixing to take turns drinking the milk out of the coconut. I suppose they got it all cracked out of the shell and ate up by now. By the coconut, I mean, Judge. You ought to step down into Franklin Street and take a look at the picture whilst there was still time. You never seen such a funny sight in all your days, I'll bet. I reckon 'twould be too late to be starting now, said Judge Priest. I'm right sorry I missed it. Busy catching up, huh? Yes, I reckon he is. Tell me, son, what did you make out of the way Peep O'Day acted? Why, sir, stated Mr. Quarles, to me mind, Judge, there ain't no manner of doubt but what prosperity has went to his head and turned it. He acted to me like a plumb distracted idiot. A grown man with 40,000 pounds of solid money setting on the side of a gutter eating gimcracks with a passel of dirty little boys. Can you figure it out any other way, Judge, except that his mind is gone? Well, I don't set myself up to be a specialist in mental disorders, son, said Judge Priestley softly. But since you asked me the question, I should say, speaking offhand, that it looks to me more as if the heart was the organ that was mainly affected. And possibly, he added this last with a dry little smile, and possibly, by now, the stomach also. Whether or not Mr. Quarles was correct in his psychopathic diagnosis, he certainly had been right when he told Judge Priest that the word was already over the business district. It had spread fast and was still spreading. It spread to beat the wireless, traveling as it did by that mouth-to-ear method of communication which is so amazingly swift and generally so tremendously incorrect. Persons who could not credit the tale at all nevertheless lost no time in giving it a yet wider circulation, so that, as though borne on the wind, it moved in every direction, like ripples on a pond, and with each time of retelling the size of the legacy grew. The daily Evening News, appearing on the streets at 5 p.m., confirmed the tale, though by its account the tune was reduced to a sum far below the gorgeously aggregated estimates of most of the earlier narrators. Between breakfast and supper time, Peep O'Day's position in the common estimation of his fellow citizens underwent a radical and revolutionary change. He ceased, automatically as it were, to be a town character. He became, by universal consent, a town notable, whose every act and every word would thereafter be subjected to close scrutiny and closer analysis. The next day the nation at large had opportunity to know of the great good fortune that had befallen Paul Felix O'Day, for the story had been wired to the city papers by the local correspondents of the same, and the press associations had picked up a stickful of the story and sped it broadcast over leased wires. Many who until that day had never heard of the fortunate man, or indeed of the place where he lived, at once manifested a concern in his well-being. Certain firms of investment brokers in New York and Chicago promptly added a new name to what vulgarly they called their sucker lists. Dealers in mining stocks, in oil stocks, and all kinds of attractive stocks showed interest. In circular form, samples of the most optimistic and alluring literature the world has ever known were consigned to the post, addressed to Mr. P.F. O'Day, such and such a town, such and such a state, care of general delivery. Various lonesome ladies in various lonesome places lost no time in sitting themselves down and inditing congratulatory letters. Object, matrimony. Some of these were single ladies, others had been widowed either by death or request. Various other persons of both sexes residing here, there, and elsewhere in our country suddenly remembered that they too were descended from the O'Days of Ireland, and wrote on forthwith to claim proud and fond relationship with the particular O'Day who had come into money. It was a remarkable circumstance, which speedily developed, that one man should have so many distant cousins scattered over the Union, and a thing equally noteworthy, that practically all these kinspeople, through no fault of their own, should at the present moment be in such straitened circumstances and in such dire need of temporary assistance of a financial nature. Ticker and printer's ink, operating in conjunction, certainly did their work mighty well. Even so, several days were to elapse before the news reached one who, of all those who read it, had most cause to feel a profound personal sensation in the intelligence. This delay, however, was nowise to be blamed upon the tardiness of the newspapers. It was occasioned by the fact that the person referred to was for the moment well out of contact with the active currents of world affairs, he being confined to a workhouse in Evansville, Indiana. As soon as he had rallied from the shock, this individual set about making plans to put himself in direct touch with the inheritor. He had ample time in which to frame and shape his campaign, inasmuch as there remained for him yet to serve nearly 8 long and painfully tedious weeks of a 3 months' vagrancy sentence. Unlike most of those now manifesting their interest, he did not write a letter, but he dreamed dreams that made him forget the annoyances of a ball and chain fast on his ankle, and piles of stubborn stones to be cracked up into fine bits with a heavy hammer. But we're getting ahead of our narrative, though. Days ahead of it. The chronological sequence of events properly dates from the morning following the morning when Peep O'Day, having been abruptly translated from the masses of the penniless to the classes of the wealthy, had forthwith embarked upon the gastronomic orgy so graphically detailed by Deputy Sheriff Quarles. On that next day, more eyes probably than had been trained in Peep O'Day's direction in all the unremarked and unremarkable days of his life put together were focused upon him. Persons who theretofore had regarded his existence, if indeed they gave it a thought, as one of the utterly trivial and inconsequential incidents of the cosmic scene, were moved to speak to him, to clasp his hand, and in numerous instances to express a hearty satisfaction over his altered circumstances. To all these, whether they were moved by mere neighbourly goodwill, or perchance were inspired by impulses of selfishness, the old man exhibited a mien of aloofness and embarrassment. This diffidence, or this suspicion, or this whatever it was, protected him from those who might entertain covetous and ulterior designs upon his inheritance, even better than though had he been brusque and rude, while those who sought to question him regarding his plans for the future drew from him only mumbled and evasive replies, which left them as deeply in the dark as they had been before. Altogether, in his intercourse with adults, he appeared shy and very ill at ease. It was noted, though, that early in the forenoon he attached to him perhaps half a dozen urchins, of whom the oldest could scarcely have been more than 12 or 13 years of age, and that these youngsters remained his companions throughout the day. Likewise, the events of that day were such as to confirm a majority of the observers in practically the same belief that had been voiced of Mr. Quarles, namely, that whatever scanty brains Peep O'Day may have ever had were now completely addled by the stroke of luck that had befallen him. In fairness to all, to O'Day and to the town critics who sat in judgment upon his behaviour, it should be stated that his conduct at the very outset was not entirely devoid of evidence of sanity. With his troop of ragged juveniles trailing behind him, he first visited Felsberg Brothers' Emporium to exchange his old and disreputable costume for a wardrobe that, in accordance with Judge Priest's recommendation, he had ordered on the afternoon previous, and which had since been undergoing certain necessary alterations. With his meagre frame encased in new black woolens, and wearing, as an incongruous added touch, the most brilliant of neckties, a necktie of the shade of a pomegranate blossom, he presently issued from Felsberg Brothers and entered Mr. Biederman's shoe store, 2 doors below. Here Mr. Biederman fitted him with shoes, and in addition noted down a further order, which the purchaser did not give until after he had conferred earnestly with the members of his youthful entourage. These watching this scene from a distance saw, and perhaps marvelled at the sight, that already, between these small boys on the one part, and this old man on the other, a perfect understanding appeared to have been established. After leaving Biederman's and tagged by his small escorts, O'Day went straight to the courthouse, and upon knocking at the door was admitted to Judge Priest's private chambers, the boys meantime waiting outside in the hall. When he came forth, he showed them something he held in his hand and told them something, whereupon all of them burst into excited and joyous whoops. It was at that point that O'Day, by the common verdict of most grown-up onlookers, began to betray the vagaries of a disordered intellect. Not that his reason had not been under suspicion already as a result of his freakish excess in the matter of B. Weil & Sons wares on the preceding day, but the relapse that now followed, as nearly everyone agreed, was even more pronounced, even more symptomatic than the earlier attack of aberration. In brief, this is what had happened. To begin with Mr. Virgil Overall, who dealt in lands and houses and sold insurance of all the commoner varieties on the side, had stalked O'Day to this point, and was lying in wait for him as he came out of the courthouse into the public square, being anxious to describe to him some especially desirable bargains in both improved and unimproved realty. Also, Mr. Overall was prepared to book him for life, accident, and health policies on the spot. So pleased was Mr. Overall at having distanced his professional rivals in the hunt that he dribbled at the mouth. But the warmth of his disappointment and indignation dried up the salivary fonts instantly when the prospective patron declined to listen to him at all, and, breaking free from Mr. Overall's detaining clasp, hurried on into Legal Row with his small convoys trotting along ahead and alongside him. At the door of the Blue Goose Saloon and Short Order Restaurant, its proprietor, by name Link Iserman, was lurking, as it were, in ambush. He hailed the approaching O'Day most cordially. He inquired in a warm voice regarding O'Day's health, and then, with a rare burst of generosity, he invited, nay, urged O'Day to step inside and have something on the house. Wines, ales, liquors, or cigars, it was all one to Mr. Iserman. The other merely shook his head, and, without a word of thanks for the offer, passed on as though bent upon an important mission. Mark how the proofs were accumulating. The man had disdained the company of men of approximately his own age or thereabout. He had refused an opportunity to partake of refreshment suitable to his years. And now he stepped into the Bon Ton toy store and bought for cash, most inconceivable of acquisitions, a little wagon that was painted bright red and bore on its sides in curlicued letters the name Comet. His next stop was at Bishop and Bryan's grocery, where, with the aid of his youthful compatriots, he first discriminatingly selected and then purchased on credit, and finally loaded into the wagon such purchases as a dozen bottles of soda pop, assorted flavors, cheese, crackers, soda and animal, sponge cakes with weatherproof pink icing on them, fruits of the season, cove oysters, a bottle of pepper sauce, and a quantity of the extra-large-sized bright green cucumber pickles known to the trade as the fancy jumbo brand Prime Selected. Presently the astonishing spectacle was presented of two small boys, with string bridles on their arms, drawing the wagon through the town and out of it into the country, with Peep O'Day in the role of teamster walking alongside the laden wagon. He was holding the lines in his hands and shouting orders at his team, who showed a colty inclination to shy at objects, to kick up their heels without provocation, and at intervals to try to run away. 8 or 10 small boys, for by now the troop had grown in number and in volume of noise, trailed along, keeping step with their elderly patron, and advising him shrilly regarding the management of his refractory span. As it turned out, the destination of this preposterous procession was Bradshaw's Grove, where the entire party spent the day picnicking in the woods and, as reported by several reliable witnesses, playing games. It was not so strange that holidaying boys should play games. The amazing feature of the performance was that Peep O'Day, a man old enough to be grandfather to any of them, played with them, being by turns an Indian chief, a robber baron, and the driver of a stage-coach attacked by wild western desperadoes. When he returned to town at dusk, drawing his little red wagon behind him, his new suit was rumpled into many wrinkles and marked by dust and grass stains. His flame-coloured tie was twisted under one ear, his new straw hat was mashed quite out of shape, and in his eyes was a light that sundry citizens on meeting him could only interpret for sparks struck from inner fires of madness. End of Boys Will Be Boys, Part 1, by Irvin S. Cobb. Read by Mike Harris. Boys Will Be Boys, Part 2, by Irvin S. Cobb. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mike Harris. Days that came after this, on through the midsummer, were, with variations, but repetitions of the day I have just described. Each morning Peep O'Day would go to either the courthouse or Judge Priest's home to turn over to the judge the unopened mail which had been delivered to him at Gafford's stables. Then he would secure from the judge a loan of money against his inheritance. Generally the amount of his daily borrowing was $1. Rarely was it so much as $2, and only once was it more than $2. By nightfall the sum would have been expended upon perfectly useless and absolutely childish devices. It might be that he would buy toy pistols and paper caps for himself and his following of urchins, or that his whim would lead him to expend all the money in tin flutes. In one case, the group he so incongruously headed would be for that one day a gang of make-believe banditti. In another, they would constitute themselves a fife and drum corps, with barrel-tops for the drums, and would march through the streets where scandalized adults stood in their tracks to watch them go by, they all the while making weird sounds, which with them passed for music. Or again, the available cash resources would be invested in provender. And then there would be an outing in the woods. Under Peep O'Day's captaincy, his chosen band of youngsters picked dewberries. They went swimming together in Guthrie's gravel pit out by the old fairgrounds, where his spare naked shanks contrasted strongly with their plump freckled legs, as all of them splashed through the shallows, making for deep water. Under his leadership they stole watermelons from Mr. Dick Bell's patch, afterward eating their spoils in thickets of grapevines along the banks of Perkins Creek. It was felt that mental befuddlement and mortal folly could reach no greater heights, or no lower depths, than on a certain hour of a certain day along toward the end of August, when O'Day came forth from his quarters in Gafford's stables, wearing a pair of boots that Mr. Bedeman's establishment had turned out to his order and his measure. Not such boots as a sensible man might be expected to wear, but boots that were exaggerated and monstrous counterfeits of the red-topped, scroll-fronted, brass-toed, stub-heeled, squeaky-soled booties that small boys of an earlier generation possessed. very proudly and seemingly unconscious of, or at least oblivious to, the derisive remarks that the appearance of these new belongings drew from many persons, the owner went clumping about in them with the rumply legs of his trousers tucked down in them, and ballooning up and out over the tops in folds which overlapped from his knee-joints halfway down his attenuated calves. As Deputy Sheriff Quarles said, the combination was a sight fit to make a horse laugh. It may be that small boys have a lesser sense of humor than horses have, for certainly the boys who were the old man's invariable shadows did not laugh at him, or at his boots either. Between the whiskered senior and his small comrades there existed a freemasonry that made them all sense a thing beyond the ken of most of their elders. Perhaps this was because the elders, being blind in their superior wisdom, saw neither this thing nor the communion that flourished. They saw only the farcical joke. But His Honor, Judge Priest, to cite a conspicuous exception, seemed not to see the lamentable comedy of it. Indeed, it seemed to some almost as if Judge Priest were aiding and abetting the befogged O'Day in his demented enterprises, his peculiar excursions and his weird purchases. If he did not actually encourage him in these constant exhibitions of witlessness, certainly there were no evidences available to show that he sought to dissuade O'Day from his strange course. At the end of a fortnight, one citizen in whom patience had ceased to be a virtue, and to whose nature long-continued silence on any public topic was intolerable, felt it his duty to speak to the judge upon the subject. This gentleman, his name was S.P. Escott, held with many that, for the good name of the community, steps should be taken to abate the infantile, futile activities of the besotted legatee. Afterward, Mr. Escott, giving a partial account of the conversation with Judge Priest to certain of his friends, showed unfeigned annoyance at the outcome. "I claim that the old man's not fitting to be running a court any longer," he stated bitterly. "He's too old and peevish. That's what ails him. For one, I'm certain not never going to vote for him again. Why, it's getting to be as much as a man's life's worth to stop that there spiteful old crank in the street and put a civil question to him. That's what's the matter." "All right. What happened, S.P.?" inquired someone. Why, here's what happened," explained the aggrieved Mr. Escott. "I hadn't any more than started in to tell him the whole town was talking about the way that daffy old Peep O'Day was carrying on, and that something had ought to be done about it. And didn't he think it was beholden on him as a circuit judge to do something right away, such as having O'Day tuck up and tried for a lunatic? And that I, for one, was ready and willing to testify to the crazy things I'd seen done with my own eyes, when he cut in on me and just as good as told me to my own face that if I'd quit tending to other people's business, I'd maybe have more business of my own to tend to. Think of that, gentlemen. A circuit court judge bemeaning a citizen and a taxpayer." He checked himself briefly. "Anyway, a citizen, that-a-way. It shows he can't be rational his own self. Personally, I claim old Priest is failing mentally. He must be. And if anybody can be found to run agin him at the next election, you gentlemen just watch and see who gets my vote." Having uttered this threat with deep and significant emphasis, Mr. Escott, still muttering, turned and entered the front gate of his boarding-house. Well, it was not exactly his boarding-house. His wife ran it, but Mr. Escott lived there and voted from there. But the apogee of Peep O'Day's carnival of weird vagaries of deportment came at the end of 2 months. 2 months in which each day the man furnished cumulative and piled-up material for derisive and jocular comment on the part of a very considerable proportion of his fellow townsmen. 3 occurrences of a widely dissimilar nature, yet all closely interrelated to the main issue, marked the climax of the man's new role in his new career. The first of these was the arrival of his legacy. The second was a one-ring circus, and the third and last was a nephew. In the form of sundry bills of exchange, the estate left by the late Daniel O'Day of the town of Kilmare in the island of Ireland was on a certain afternoon delivered over into Judge Priest's hands, and by him in turn handed to the rightful owner, after which sundry indebtednesses, representing the total of the old judge's day-to-day cash advances to O'Day, were liquidated. The ceremony of deducting this sum took place at the Planters' Bank, whither the two had journeyed in company from the courthouse, having, with the aid of the paying teller, instructed O'Day in the technical details requisite to the drawing of personal checks. Judge Priest went home and had his bag packed, and left for Reelfoot Lake to spend a week fishing. As a consequence, he missed the remaining 2 events following immediately thereafter. The circus was no great shakes of a circus, in no grand, glittering, gorgeous, glorious pageant of education and entertainment, travelling on its own special trains. No vast, tented city of world's wonders and world's champions, heralded for weeks and weeks in advance of its coming by dead walls emblazoned with the finest examples of the lithographer's art. Oh, and by half-page advertisements in the daily evening news. On the contrary, it was a shabby little wagon show, which, coming overland on short notice, rolled into town under horsepower, and set up its ragged and dusty canvases on the vacant lot across from Yeiser's drugstore. Compared with the street parade of any of its great and famous rivals, the street parade of this circus was a meagre and disappointing thing. Why, there was only one elephant, a dwarfish and debilitated-looking creature, worn mangy and slick on its various angles, like the cover of an old-fashioned haircloth trunk. And obviously most of the closed cages were weather-beaten stake wagons in disguise. Nevertheless, there was a sizable turnout of people for the afternoon performance. After all, a circus was a circus. Moreover, this particular circus was marked at the afternoon performance by happenings of a nature most decidedly unusual. At 1 o'clock the doors were opened. At 1:10 the eyes of the proprietor were made glad, and his heart was uplifted within him by the sight of a strange procession drawing nearer and nearer across the scuffed turf of the common, and heading in the direction of the red ticket wagon. At the head of the procession marched Peep O'Day, only of course the proprietor didn't know it was Peep O'Day, a queer figure in his rumpled black clothes and his red-topped brass-toed boots, and with one hand holding fast to the string of a captive toy balloon. Behind him, in an uneven jostling formation, followed many small boys and some small girls. A census of the ranks would have developed that here were included practically all the juvenile white population who otherwise, through a lack of funds, would have been denied the opportunity to patronize this circuit, or, in fact, any circus. Each member of the joyous company was likewise the bearer of a toy balloon, red, yellow, blue, green, or purple, as the case might be. Over the line of heads the taut, rubbery globes rode on their tethers, nodding and twisting like so many big, iridescent bubbles. And half a block away, at the edge of the lot, a balloon vendor whose entire stock had been disposed of in one splendid transaction, now stood, empty-handed but full-pocketed, marvelling at the stroke of luck that enabled him to take an afternoon off and rest his voice. Out of a seemingly bottomless exchequer, Peep O'Day brought tickets of admission for all. But this was only the beginning. Once inside the tent, he procured accommodations in the reserved seat section for himself and those who accompanied him. From such superior points of vantage the whole crew of them witnessed the performance, from the thrilling grand entry with spangled ladies and gentlemen riding 2 by 2 on broad-backed steeds, to the tumbling about introducing the full strength of the company, which of course came at the end. They munched fresh roasted peanuts and balls of sugar-coated popcorn, slightly rancid, until they munched no longer with zest but merely mechanically. They drank pink lemonade to an extent that threatened absolute depletion of the fluid contents of both barrels on the refreshment stand out in the menagerie tent. They whooped their unbridled approval when the wild Indian chief, after shooting down a stuffed coon with a bow and arrow from somewhere up near the top of the center pole, while balancing himself jauntily erect upon the haunches of a coursing white charger, suddenly flung off his feathered headdress, his wig, and his fringed leather garments, and revealed himself in pink fleshings as the principal bareback rider. They screamed in a chorus of delight when the funny old clown, who had been forcibly deprived of 3 tin flutes in rapid succession, now produced yet a 4th from the seemingly inexhaustible depths of his baggy white pants, a flute with a string and a bent pin attached to it, and, secretly affixing the pin in the tail of the cross ringmaster's coat, was thereafter enabled to toot sharp, shrill blasts at frequent intervals, much to the chagrin of the ringmaster, who seemed utterly unable to discover the whereabouts of the instrument dangling behind him. But no one among them whooped louder or laughed longer than their elderly and bewhiskered friend. who sat among them paying the bills. As his guests, they stayed for the concert, and following this they patronized the sideshow in a body. They had been almost the first upon the scene. Assuredly they were the last of the audience to quit it. Indeed, before they tailed their confrère away from the spot, the sun was nearly down, and at scores of supper tables all over town the tale of poor old Peep O'Day's latest exhibition of freakishness was being retailed, with elaborations, to interested auditors. Estimates of the sum probably expended by him in this crowning extravagance ranged well up into the hundreds of dollars. As for the object of these speculations, he was destined not to eat any supper at all that night. Something happened that so upset him as to make him forget the meal altogether. It began to happen when he reached the modest home of P. Gafford, adjoining the Gafford stables, on Locust Street, and found sitting on the lowermost step of the porch a young man of untidy and unshaved aspect, who hailed him affectionately as Uncle Paul, and who showed deep annoyance and acute distress upon being rebuffed with chill words. It's possible that the strain of serving a 3-month sentence on the technical charge of vagrancy in a workhouse somewhere in Indiana had affected the young man's nerves. His ankle bones still ached where the ball and chain had been hitched. On his palms the blisters induced by the incongenial use of a sledgehammer on a rock pile had hardly as yet turned to calluses. So it's only fair to presume that his nervous system felt the strain of his recent confining experiences also. Almost tearfully he pleaded with Peep O'Day to remember the ties of blood that bound them. Repeatedly he pointed out that he was the only known kinsman of the other in all the world, and, of course, therefore, had more reason than any other living being to expect kindness and generosity at his uncle's hands. He spoke socialistically of the advisability of an equal division. Failing to make any impression here, he mentioned the subject of a loan, at first hopefully, but finally despairingly. When he was done, Peep O'Day, in a perfectly colourless and unsympathetic voice, bade him good-bye. Not good night, but good-bye. And going inside the house, he closed the door behind him, leaving his newly returned relative outside and quite alone. At this the young man uttered violent language, but since there was nobody present to hear him, it is likely he found small satisfaction in his profanity, rich though it may have been in metaphor and variety. So presently he betook himself off, going straight to the office in Legal Row of H.B. Sublette, attorney at law. From the circumstance that he found Mr. Sublette in, though it was long past that gentleman's office hours, and, moreover, found Mr. Sublette waiting in an expectant and attentive attitude, it might have been adduced by one skilled in the trick of putting two and two together that the pair of them had reached a prior understanding some time during the day, and that the visit of the young man to the Gafford home and his speeches there had all been parts of a scheme planned out at a prior operation. Be this as it may, so soon as Mr. Sublette had heard his caller's version of the meeting upon the porch, he lost no time in taking certain legal steps. That very night, on behalf of his client, denominated in the documents as Percival Dwyer, Esquire, he prepared a petition addressed to the Circuit Judge of the district, setting forth that inasmuch as Paul Felix O'Day had by divers acts shown himself to be of unsound mind, now therefore came his nephew and next of kin, praying that a committee or curator be appointed to take over the estate of the said Paul Felix O'Day, and administer the same in accordance with the orders of the court, until such time as the said Paul Felix O'Day should recover his reason, or should pass from this life, and so forth and so on, not to mention whereases in great number, and aforesaids abounding through the text in the utmost profusion. On the following morning the papers were filed with Circuit Clerk Millam. That vigilant barrister, Mr. Sublette, brought them in person to the court-house before 9 o'clock, he having the interests of his client at heart, and perhaps also visions of a large contingent fee in his mind. No retainer had been paid. The state of Mr. Dwyer's finances, or rather the absence of any finances, had precluded the performance of that customary detail, but to Mr. Sublette's experienced mind the prospects of future increment seemed large. Accordingly, he was all for prompt action. Formally, he said he wished to go on record as demanding for his principal a speedy hearing of the issue, with a view to preventing the defendant named in the pleadings from dissipating any more of the estate lately bequeathed to him, and now fully in his possession, or words to that effect. Mr. Malam felt justified in getting into communication with Judge Priest over the long-distance phone, and the judge, cutting short his vacation and leaving uncaught vast numbers of bass and perch in Reelfoot Lake, came home, arriving late that night. Next morning, having issued diverse orders in connection with the impending litigation, he sent a messenger to find Peep O'Day, and to direct O'Day to come to the courthouse for a personal interview. Shortly thereafter, a scene that had occurred some 2 months earlier, with His Honour's private chamber for a setting, was substantially duplicated. There was the same cast of two, the same stage properties, the same atmosphere of untidy tidiness, and, as before, the dialogue was in Judge Priest's hands. He led, and his fellow character followed his leads. "Pete," he was saying, "you understand, don't you, that this here fragrant nephew of yours that's turned up from nowheres in particular is fixing to get ready to try to prove that you are feeble-minded? Oh, and on top of that, he's going to ask that a committee be appointed for you. In other words, that somebody or other shall be named by the court, meaning me, to take charge of your property and control the spending of it from now on?" "Yes, sir," stated O'Day. "Pete Gafford, he sat down with me and made it all clear to me yesterday evening, after they'd done served the papers on me." "All right, then. Now, I'm going to fix the hearing for tomorrow morning at 10. The other side is asking for a quick decision, and I rather figure that they're entitled to it. Is that agreeable to you?" "Whatever you say, Judge." "Well, have you retained a lawyer to represent your interests in court? That's the main question that I sent for you to ask you." "Do I need a lawyer, Judge?" "Well, there have been times when I regarded lawyers as being superfluous," stated Judge Priest dryly. "Still, in most cases, litigants do have 'em round when the case is being heard." "Well, I don't know as I need any lawyer to help me say what I've got to say," said O'Day. "Judge, you ain't never asked me no questions about the way I've been carrying on since I come into this here money. But I reckon maybe this is as good a time as any to tell you just why I've been acting the way I've done. You see, sir—" "Hold on," broke in Judge Priest. "Up to now, as my friend, it would have been perfectly proper for you to give me your confidences if you was minded so to do. But now I reckon you'd better not. You see, I'm the judge that's got to decide whether you are a responsible person, whether you're mentally capable of handling your own financial affairs, or whether you ain't. So you'd better wait and make your statement in your own behalf to me whilst I'm sitting on the bench. I'll see that you get an opportunity to do so, and I'll listen to it, and I'll give it all the consideration it's deserving of. And, on second thought, perhaps it would only be a waste of time and money for you to go hiring a lawyer, especially to represent you. Under the law, it's my duty, in such a case as here one is, to appoint a member of the bar to serve during the proceedings as your guardian ad litem. You don't need to be startled," he added, as O'Day flinched at the sound in his ears of these strange and fearsome words. "A guardian ad litem is simply a lawyer that tends to your affairs till the case is settled one way or the other. If you had a dozen lawyers, I'd have to appoint them just the same, so you don't need to worry about that part of it. Well, that's all. You can go now if you want to. Only if I was you, I wouldn't draw out any more money from the bank twixt now and the time when I make my decision." All things considered, it was an unusual assemblage that Judge Priest regarded over the top rims of his glasses, as he sat facing it in his broad armchair, with the flat top of the bench intervening between him and the gathering. Not often, even in the case of exciting murder trials, had the old courtroom held a larger crowd. Certainly never had it held so many boys. Boys, and boys exclusively, filled the back rows of benches downstairs. More boys packed the narrow shelf-like balcony that spanned the chamber across its far end. Mainly small boys, barefooted, sunburned, freckle-faced, shock-headed boys. And for boys, they were strangely silent and strangely attentive. The petitioner sat with his counsel, Mr. Sublette. The petitioner had been newly shaved, and for some mysterious source had been equipped with a neat wardrobe. Plainly he was endeavouring to wear a look of virtue, which was a difficult undertaking, as you would understand had you known the petitioner. The defending party to the action was seated across the room, touching elbows with old Colonel Farrell, dean of the local bar and its most florid orator. The court will designate Colonel Horatio Farrell as guardian ad litem for the defendant during these proceedings, Judge Priest had stated a few minutes earlier, using the formal and grammatical language he reserved exclusively for his court room. At once old Colonel Farrell had hitched his chair up alongside O'Day, had asked him several questions in a tone inaudible to those about them, had listened to the whispered answers of O'Day, and then had nodded his huge curly white dome of a head, as though amply satisfied with the responses. Let us skip the preliminaries. True, they seemed to interest the audience. Here, though, they would be tedious reading. Likewise, in touching upon the opening and outlining address of Attorney-at-Law Sublett, let us, for the sake of time and space, be very much briefer than Mr. Sublett was. For our present purposes, I deem it sufficient to say that in all his professional career, Mr. Sublett was never more eloquent, never more forceful, never more vehement in his allegations, and never more convinced, as he himself stated not once but repeatedly, of his ability to prove the facts he alleged by competent and unbiased testimony. These facts, he pointed out, were common knowledge in the community. Nevertheless, he stood prepared to buttress them with the evidence of reputable witnesses given under oath. Mr. Sublett, having unwound at length, now wound up. He sat down, perspiring freely, and through the perspiration radiating confidence in his contentions, confidence in the result, and, most of all, unbounded confidence in Mr. Sublett. Now Colonel Farrell was standing up to address the court, under the cloak of a theatrical presence and a large orotund manner, and behind a Ciceronian command of sonorous language. The colonel carried concealed a shrewd old brain. It was as though a skilled marksman lurked in ambush amid a tangle of luxuriant foliage. In this particular instance, moreover, it is barely possible that the colonel was acting on a cue privily conveyed to him before the court opened. "May it please your Honor," he began, "I have just conferred with the defendant here, and acting in the capacity of his guardian ad litem, I have advised him to waive an opening address by counsel. Indeed, the defendant has no counsel. Furthermore, the defendant, also acting upon my advice, will present no witnesses in his own behalf, but, with your Honor's permission, the defendant will now make a personal statement, and thereafter he will rest content, leaving the final arbitration of the issue to your Honor's discretion." "I object," exclaimed Mr. Sublett briskly. "On what ground does the learned counsel object?" "On the grounds that since the mental competence of this man is concerned, since it is our contention that he is patently and plainly a victim of senility, an individual prematurely in his dotage, any utterances by him will be of no value whatsoever in aiding the conscience and intelligence of the court to arrive at a fair and just conclusion regarding the defendant's mental condition." Mr. Sublett excelled in the use of big words. There was no doubt about that. "The objection is overruled," said Judge Priest. He nodded in the direction of O'Day and Colonel Farrell. "The court will hear the defendant. He is not to be interrupted while making his statement. The defendant may proceed." Without further urging, O'Day stood up, a tall, slab-sided rack of a man, with his long arms dangling at his side, half facing Judge Priest and half facing his nephew and his nephew's lawyer. Without hesitation, he began to speak, and this is what he said. "There's maybe some here as knows about how I was raised and fetched up. My pa and my ma died when I was just only a baby, so I was brung up out here at the old county poorhouse as a pauper. I can't remember the time when I didn't have to work for my board and keep, and work hard. While other boys were going to school and playing hooky and going in washing in the creek and playing games and all such as that, I had to work. I never done no playing round in my whole life, not till here just recently anyway. But I always craved to play round some. I didn't never say nothing about it to nobody after I growed up, because I figured it out that they wouldn't understand and maybe they'd laugh at me. But all these years, ever since I left that there poorhouse, I've had a hankering here inside of me," and he lifted one hand and touched his breast. "I've had a hankering to be a boy, and do all the things a boy does, to do the things I was chiseled out of doing whilst I was of a suitable age to be doing them. I call to mind that I used to dream in my sleep about doing them, but the dream never come true, not till just here lately. It didn't have no chance to come true. Not till then. So when this money come to me so sudden and unbeknownst, like, I said to myself that I was going to make that there dream come true, and I started out for to do it, and I done it. And I reckon that's the cause of my being here today, accused of being feeble-minded. But even so, I don't regret it none. If it was all to do over again, I'd do it just the very same way. Well, I never knowed what it was till here 2 months or so ago to have my fill of bananas and candy and ginger snaps and all such knick-knacks as them. All my life I've been craving secretly to own a pair of red-topped boots with brass toes on them, like I used to see other boys wearing in the winter-time when I was out yonder at that poorhouse, wearing an old pair of somebody else's cast-off shoes. Maybe a man's shoes with rags wrapped around my feet to keep the snow from coming through the cracks in them, and to keep them from slipping right spang off my feet. I got 3 toes frostbit once during a cold spell wearing them kind of shoes. But here the other week I found myself able to buy me some red-top boots with brass toes on them, so I had 'em made to order, and I'm wearing 'em now. I wear 'em regular, even if it is summertime. I take a heap of pleasure out of 'em. And also, all my life long, I've been wanting to go to a circus. But not till 3 days ago, I didn't never get no chance to go to one. Now that gentleman yonder, Mr. Sublet, he lowed just that I was leading a lot of little boys in this here town into bad habits. He said that I was learning them nobody knowed what devilment. And he spoke of my having egged him on to steal watermelons from Mr. Bell's watermelon patch out there 3 miles from town on the Marshallville gravel road. You all heard what he just now said about that. I didn't mean no offense, and I beg his pardon for contradicting him right out for everybody here in the big courthouse. But, mister, you're wrong. I didn't lead these here boys astray that I've been running around with. They're mighty nice, clean boys, all of 'em. Some of 'em are mighty near as poor as what I used to be, but there ain't no real harm in any of 'em. We get along together just fine, me and them, and without no preaching nor nothing like that. I've done my best these weeks. We've been frolicking and projecting round together to keep 'em from growing up to do mean things. I use chawing tobacco myself, but I've told 'em I don't know how many times that if they chaw it'll stunt 'em in their growth, and I've got several of 'em that was smoking cigarettes on the slide, promised me they'd quit. So I don't figure as I've done them boys any real harm by going round with 'em, and I believe if you was to ask 'em, they'd all tell you the same, so. Now, about them watermelons. Since this gentleman has brung them watermelons up, I'm going to tell you the whole truth about that, too. He cast a quick, furtive look, almost a guilty look, toward the rear of the courthouse before he went on. Them watermelons wasn't really stole at all. I seen Mr. Dick Bell forehand and arranged with him to pay him in full for whatever damage might be done. But, you see, I knowed watermelons stays sweeter to a boy if he thought he'd hooked him out of a patch. So I never let on to my little partners yonder that I'd the same as paid Mr. Bell in advance for the melons we snuck out of his patch and out in the woods. They've all been thinking up till now that we really hooked them watermelons, but that was wrong. I'm sorry for it. Mr. Sublet, you just now said that I was fritting away my property on vain foolishment. I think them's was the words you said, frittering and vain foolishment. Well, maybe you're right, sir, about the frittering part. But if spending money in a certain way gives a man as much pleasure as it's given me these last 4 months, if the money is his'n by rights, I figure it can't be so very foolish, though it may appear so to some. Excusing these here clothes I got on and these here boots, which I ain't paid for yet, is charging up to me on Feldberg Brothers books and Mr. M. Biederman's books. I didn't spend only $1 a day, or maybe $2, and once $3 in a single day out of what was coming to me. Now, the judge here, he let me have that out of his own pocket, and I paid him back. And that was all I did spend till here 3 days ago when their circus come to town. I reckon I did spend right smart then. But money had come from the old country only the day before, so I went to the bank and they writ out one of them pieces of paper which is called a check, and I signed it with my mark, and they give me the money I wanted, and even $200, and part of that their money I used to pay for circus tickets for all the little boys and little girls I could find in this town that couldn't have got to the circus no other way. Some of them are sitting back there behind you all now. Some of the boys, I mean. I don't see none of the little girls. There was several of them told me at the time that they hadn't never seen a circus, not in their whole lives. For that matter, I hadn't either, but I didn't want no poor child in this town to grow up to be as old as I am without having been to at least one circus. So I'd taken 'em all in and paid all the bills, and when night come there wasn't but about $9 left out of the whole $200 that I'd started out with in the morning. But I don't begrudge spending it. It looked to me like it was money well invested. They all seemed to enjoy it, and I know I done so. There may be bigger circuses than what that one was, but I don't see how a circus could have been any better than this here one I'm telling you about. If it was 10 times as big, I don't regret the investment, and I don't aim to lie about it now. Mr. Sublet, I'd do the same thing over again if the chance should come, lawsuit or no law-wit. If you should win this here case, maybe I wouldn't have no second chance. If some gentleman is appointed as a committee to handle my money, it's likely he wouldn't look at the thing the same way I do. And it's likely he wouldn't let me have so much money all in one lump to spend taking a passel of little shavers that ain't no kin to me, to the circus, and to the sideshow, besides letting them stay for the grand concert or after show and all. But I've done it once, and I've got it to remember about and think about in my own mind as long as I live. I'm about finished now. There's just one thing more I'd like to say, and that is this. Mr. Sublet, now, he said a minute or so ago that I was in my second childhood. Meaning no offense, sir, but you was wrong there, too. The way I look at it, a man can't be in his second childhood without he's had his first childhood, and I was cheated plumb out of mine. I'm more than 60 years old, as near as I can figure, but I'm trying to be a boy before it's too late. He paused a minute and looked around him. The way I look at it, Judge Priest, son, y'all, every man that grows up, no matter how old he may get to be, is entitled to have been a boy once in his life. I reckon that's all. He sat down and dropped his eyes upon the floor, as though ashamed that his temerity should have carried him so far. There was a strange little hush filling the courthouse. It was Judge Priest who broke it. "The court," he said, "has by the words just spoken by this man been sufficiently advised as to the sanity of the man himself. The court cares to hear nothing more from either side on this subject. The petition is dismissed." Very probably these last words may have been as much Greek to the juvenile members of the audience, possibly, though they were made aware of the meaning of them by the look upon the face of Nephew Percival Dwyer, and the look upon the face of Nephew Percival Dwyer's attorney. At any rate, His Honor hardly had uttered the last syllable of his decision before, from the rear of the courthouse and from the gallery above, there arose a shrill, vehement, sincere sound of yelling, exultant, triumphant, and deafening. It continued for upward of a minute before the small disturbers remembered where they were and reduced themselves to a state of comparative quiet. For reasons best known to himself, Judge Priest, who ordinarily stickled for order and decorum in his courtroom, made no effort to quell the outburst or have it quelled, not even when a considerable number of the adults present joined in it, having first cleared their throats of a slight huskiness that had come upon them severally and generally. Presently the judge rapped for quiet, and got it. It was apparent that he had more to say, and all there hearkened to hear what it might be. "I have just this to add," quoth His Honor. "It is the official judgment of this court that the late defendant, being entirely sane, is competent to manage his own affairs after his own preferences. And it is the private opinion of this court that not only is the late defendant sane, but he is the sanest man in this entire jurisdiction. Mr. Clerk, this court stands adjourned." Coming down the 3 short steps from the raised platform of the bench, Judge Priest beckoned to Sheriff Giles Birdsong, who, at the tail of the departing crowd, was shepherding its last exuberant members through the doorway. "Giles," said Judge Priest in an undertone when the worthy sheriff had drawn near, The circuit clerk tells me that there's an indictment for malicious mischief agin this here Percy Dwyer knocking around among the records somewheres. An indictment the grand jury returned several sessions back, but which was never pressed, owing to the sudden departure from our midst of the person in question. I wonder if it would be too much trouble for you to sort of drap a hint in the ear of the young man or his lawyer that the said indictment is apt to be revived, and that the said Dwyer is liable to be tucked into custody by you and lodged in the county jail sometime during the ensuing 48 hours, without he should see his way clear during the meantime to get clean out of the city, county, and state. Now, would that be possible? What? Trouble? No, sir. It won't be no trouble to me at all, said Mr. Birdsong promptly. Why, it'll be more of a pleasure, Judge. And so it was. Except for one small added and purely incidental circumstance, our narrative is ended. That same afternoon, Judge Priest sat on the front porch of his old white house out on Clay Street, waiting for Jeff Poindexter to summon him to supper. Peep O'Day opened the front gate and come up the gravelled walk between the twin rows of silver-leaf poplars. The judge, rising to greet his visitor, met him at the top step. "Come in," bade the judge heartily, "and sit down a spell and rest your face and hands." "No, sir. Much obliged, but I ain't got only a minute to stay," said O'Day. "I just come out here, sir, to thank you for what you done today on my account in the big courthouse, and to make you a little kind of a present." "It's all right to thank me," said Judge Priest, "but I couldn't accept any reward for rendering a decision in accordance with the plain fact." "'Tain't no gift of money or nothing like that," O'Day hastened to explain. Really, sir, it don't amount to nothing at all, scusedly. But a little while ago I happened to be in Mr. B. Weil & Son's store doing a little trading, and I run across a new kind of knick-knack which it seemed like to me it was about the best thing I ever tasted in my whole life. So on the chance, sir, that you might have a sweet tooth too, I taken the liberty of bringing you a sack of 'em, and here they are, sir, 3 flavors, strawberry, lemon, and vanilla." Suddenly overcome with confusion, he dislodged a large-sized paper bag from his side-coat pocket and thrust it into Judge Priest's hands. Then, backing away, he turned and clumped down the gravel path in great and embarrassed haste. Judge Priest opened the bag and peered down into it. It contained a sticky, sugary dozen of flattened confections, each moulded round a short length of wooden splinter. These syrupy articles, which have since come into quite general use, are known, I believe, as all-day suckers. When Judge Priest looked up again, Peep O'Day was outside the gate, clumping down the uneven sidewalk of Clay Street with long strides of his booted legs. Half a dozen small boys, who, it was evident, had remained hidden during the ceremony of presentation, now mysteriously appeared and were accompanying the departing donor, half trotting to keep up with him. End of Boys Will Be Boys, Part 2, by Irvin S. Cobb. Read by Mike Harris.